Alright, hey guys, how you doing? So, as you can see that I'm just outside, and so I figured today is a good time. It's a nice sunny day, we can do our session outside. The staff room also happens to be taken, so I can't actually do my videos in there. Alright, but in this session we are going to look at Trophic Cascade and what actually happens when you alter or change an ecosystem. Okay, so let's get straight into it. Now, Trophic Cascade is defined as when you remove one species or a few species from an ecosystem, and there is this kind of flow-on effect onto other organisms in the ecosystem. Yeah, so the flow-on effect is what we call a cascade effect, and it's what happens when you muck around with an ecosystem and you alter it in any sort of way or influence it in any sort of way. Now, it's broadly categorized into two different groups. The first is what we call the top-down cascade effect, which is when you remove the apex or the tertiary consumer in the ecosystem. Now that is when you get rid of the top predator or the tertiary consumer, the effect starts at the top and then it flows down the ecosystem. It affects all the animals and the plants and the organisms below that level. The other version of a cascade is when there is a bottom-up effect. Now the bottom-up effect is when you remove the primary producer or the primary consumer, and so the effect starts at the bottom of the food web and it works its way up and it changes and alters the species closer to the top. Now every organism plays a different role in maintaining the stability of the ecosystem, and so some organisms, when they are removed, don't really have a big effect on the ecosystem and the overall stability of it. However, there are other organisms that play particularly important roles in maintaining the ecosystem, and so when you remove them, it has this dramatic change to every other species and to the entire ecosystem itself. Now, the ones that play a particularly important role in maintaining the stability of the ecosystem is called the keystone species. And the word keystone comes from an old architectural reference where when they used to make arches and doorways and things like that, the keystone was that last block you would put in which holds the entire door frame up. And so the keystone species in this case is that one organism or those few organisms in the ecosystem that keeps the whole ecosystem's functioning, and if you remove them it causes the ecosystem to collapse. Okay, now let's go with an example and we'll sort of take a look at what a top-down and bottom-up effect looks like in an actual ecosystem. Here is the Amazon food web. Okay, so in the Amazon food web, you've got a few different things. You've got energy coming from the sun, which actually then powers the primary producers, the plants, and they photosynthesize and then they generate energy for the rest of the ecosystem. You've got a few primary consumers, the tree kangaroo, the frogs, and the bandicoot. It's worth noting that the frogs, the adult frogs themselves, are actually carnivores, and they eat insects, but the tadpoles themselves can be referenced as a primary consumer because the tadpoles will eat algae and things like that in the water. Okay, your secondary consumers are your snakes and the quoll. The tertiary consumer are the crocodiles, the feral dogs, and possibly the dingoes. And then your apex predators being the jaguars and the scavengers or the detritivores are your vultures. Okay, now we're going to go through three different scenarios and sort of have a look at what is going to happen in the Amazon food web when we muck around with it. Let's start with a case scenario of jaguars being removed. Poaching or hunting has caused the jaguars to be removed and exterminated from this ecosystem, and so there are no more jaguars. What is going to happen to the rest of the food web if the jaguars removed? Well, we know that the jaguars hunt and eat crocodiles and the feral dogs. So the removal of the jaguars is going to change the amount of crocodiles or the population of crocodiles and feral dogs in our ecosystem. There is less predation on them, which means that their populations are actually going to increase. There are going to be more crocodiles and more feral dogs in this ecosystem. Now, the top-down effect is that if there are more tertiary consumers here, it also means that they are going to hunt and attack the snakes and the quolls more, which means population of quolls and snakes are going to go down in this midsection here, which has a flow-on effect, meaning that there might be more tree kangaroos, frogs, and bandicoots. Now, in real life, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that is a good example of a top-down effect. Removing jaguars is going to change the population of tertiary consumers, which therefore decreases population of secondary consumers. Yeah, and so that is one version of what might happen. Okay, and you can sort of keep going and argue your way all the way down to increase in primary consumers and therefore a decrease in plants. But realistically, the ecosystem will adjust itself in some way or another. So that's the first scenario. Now, in the second scenario, let's say that a particular disease has inflicted and affected the frogs and has wiped out the frog population in the Amazon rainforest. Now, this is actually occurring, and worldwide there are a few different diseases that are wiping out frogs worldwide, and we're still trying to figure out why that is. But let's say this disease has caused the removal of frogs in our Amazon food web. Now, this is a bottom-up effect. It is a primary consumer being removed, and we're going to find out what's going to happen if the primary consumer is being removed. Now, if there are less frogs in this case, we're going to assume, for simplicity's sake, that the competition that the frogs create between the tree kangaroos, the frogs, and the bandicoot is obviously going to lessen, which means the tree kangaroos and the bandicoot could increase in population. You could also say that because there is a lesser food source for the snakes, it means that the snakes will either decrease in population or they are going to start hunting more of the tree kangaroos and the bandicoots there. And then once again, you can sort of keep going with the flow-on effect. What happens if snake populations drop because there is less food source? Crocodile populations might also drop, and jaguar populations might also drop. Once again, we're oversimplifying the food web changes here, but that just gives you an idea of how when you change one part of the food web down here, it has this kind of flow-on effect to the other parts of the food web. And so you can see that each of these components are really dependent on one another. Okay, now let's go with our third scenario, which is if deforestation removes the plants. Yeah, you've got people coming in and they're actually removing rainforests, and the Amazon is actually the fastest rate of deforestation around the world. There is more hectares of rainforest being removed here than anywhere else in the world, and so deforestation to make way for farms and industrial areas and residents and stuff like that has caused plants to be removed. Now, this is probably the most devastating effect. It is a bottom-up effect, but it is a bottom-up effect starting at the very foundation of the ecosystem. If you remove the plants, right, you remove the habitats and the food sources for the tree kangaroos, the frogs, and the bandicoots, which causes their populations to collapse. If their populations collapse, you can see that every other section of the food web is going to collapse, and the ecosystem simply will not survive. And so you can see that this is a bottom-up effect, but it is a bottom-up effect with a very devastating cascade, in that the entire ecosystem will collapse without the plants. So those are kind of three very simple scenarios. You can see how that interplay in the ecosystems between the animals and the plants, the primary consumers, the tertiary consumers, and so forth, are really important in maintaining stability of an ecosystem. Now, an ecosystem will adjust if you give it enough time. If we go back and we remove the frogs, the snakes will adjust by hunting different species, and then the competition of the species will adjust to the removal of the frogs. However, if the change is too drastic and too soon, the cascade effect is more devastating, and the ecosystem is more likely to collapse when it doesn't have enough time to stabilize itself from that scenario. Okay. Now, in class, we are going to look at two particular case scenarios. What happens if you remove otters or sea otters from the kelp forest, and also what happens if you remove wolves from the Yellowstone National Park. And so we're going to go through that next time, but until then, I hope you guys take it easy, and I'll see you guys soon.